You making all that noise over there? Drinking, slapping.
I will.
What,
I'll
it's
turn
like
it
it's.
down.
No, look at this. Look. Hey, everybody! You hear all that noise going on? It's a guest. It's the guest. Slapping, cracking. I didn't tell him to be quiet though, so that's on me. It doesn't really matter. We don't care. We don't worry about all that professionalism stuff. We just keep it real here at Doctrine and Devotion. My name is Joe Thorne. I am the lead pastor of Redeemer Fellowship in St. Charles, Illinois. Jimmy Fofo Fowler, an executive pastor here at Redeemer, cannot make it. He was actually trying to make it for this conversation with this brother. I checked in with him, and he just can't do it. He's got work and all kinds of wheeling and dealing going on. But we do have the Krista McDude, also known as David Hughes. What's up, David?
Krista McDude?
Do you know Krista McDunn?
Yeah. Oh, God. Oh, I get it. Okay, I see.
Yeah,
That was clever.
That's a deep one. It's a deep one.
It was.
It just, so Krista McDunn is a licensed professional counselor here at Redeemer Reformed Baptist. And you are a Christian counselor, a trauma therapist, and a Reformed Baptist. So you were like our Krista McDude. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, pretty much.
So I was going to say, like, you and I, we've been chatting on social media for, I don't know, a couple of years? Is that long?
A couple of years.
Yeah.
At least that. Because you guys were in, so I discovered Doc and Devo when you guys were working through the 1689.
Okay.
So whatever year that was, we started interacting.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I'm bad at keeping track of time. So, but this is the first time we've ever spoke. Like I got to hear your voice, and you know what? Your voice sounds like you listen to like the Grateful Dead. That's the vibe that I get from you. You have that voice.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's a stoner voice, just to be clear here. I'm not saying that you are a stoner. I know you're not. I'm just saying you have that voice.
Yeah. Well, as I said before when we were exchanging texts, my condolences that Doc and Devo has hit the bottom of the guest list. You have smelly deadheads on your show.
Well, you can smell the patchouli from here. It's coming through the screen. I'm just glad you took off your tie-dye and your fake dreadlocks.
You got to keep the fake dreadlock. You got to keep it professional.
Yeah, you know? Well, because you are a professional. Now, you're a Christian counselor, and it's one of the reasons I've always really liked reading your tweets, because you care about people, you care about truth, but with all of your theological background, with the way that your mind works, you're always thoughtful and careful in your interactions with people. In fact, one of the things that I remember you messaged me about years ago, I said something like, "Oh, this person got triggered," and you were like, "Just so you know, like this is the proper use of that term. There's a better way to use it. And I was like, "Oh, I was using it like the pop culture way," and you were really cool about it. You're like, "No, I understand. It's fine. Like, no hate." But like I like nuance. I know that that's mocked today, but I like nuance and being careful with our words.
Yeah, and so this is just a pattern that happens, right? Because I have the same license that Krista has. We call it licensed clinical mental health counselor, but same thing. And anytime something leaves the realm of research and goes to the practitioner level and then finds its way, let's say, into, I don't know, some edition of a very popular magazine dealing with issues today around psychology, something like that.
Okay.
That magazine will publish a bunch of articles on the thing, and those articles are aimed at lay people. They're not written in research language. And then those things find their way into the common vernacular, whether that's being triggered, for example, having a flashback triggered, which trauma survivors often do, or anything, mindfulness, narcissism, how many unknown things are actually trauma responses. And now you see these like TikTok gurus that are like, are you super organized? That's a trauma response. Are you super disorganized? That's trauma. No. The reason I have a credential of working with trauma and resilience in the nervous system, the reason it takes 3 years to learn is because it's more nuanced than that. Right?
Wait, you mean you need to learn more than a 1,500 word article?
Yeah, you do.
Because I was feeling like an expert. I read a couple of articles. Okay, I skimmed them, and I read the headlines. But the point is, I really felt like I was ready to dive into the deep end with that knowledge base.
Yeah. A lot of people are. A lot of people do. And so the next step, Joe, is you need to start creating some memes, get a TikTok
Okay.
account, and become a coach. You don't have to do
Yes.
anything. Just call yourself a coach.
Yeah. Don't need a license for that.
No,
You just
no, you don't.
well, yeah. I mean, we've seen that, and that's one of the things that, like, pastors sometimes talk about this. Professors, I know, I would imagine, I don't know, talk about this, but like, yeah, especially in the Christian world. But I see it, like you said, I see it on TikTok. The one that I remember was everybody talking about narcissism. That was a thing for like a while, where like, oh, this is, and it's like not. Okay, even I wouldn't know, but I know like you don't know what you're talking about. And then I see these actual counselors come on and go, "Hey guys, you don't understand narcissism or the narcissistic personality disorder or whatever it is. Let me unpack it for you." And so stop doing that because you're confusing people. But one of the things that I've noticed that I continue to see is that everybody's an expert. Like in the church, everybody's an expert, and every opinion is equal. Every opinion carries equal weight because priesthood of the believer, which is not even the thing. It's the priesthood of all believers, but whatever. And so it's like, well, I got my Bible, and my opinion is as valid as anybody else's. And the reality is, it's not. Not everybody's opinion is valid. So I like people who actually give themselves to their discipline and study and read and develop and grow over time. And you're a good example of that. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about specifically is, why is trauma being talked about more today than I ever remember it being talked about in my lifetime? And what does it mean to be a trauma therapist, which I know that's what you are in part.
Yeah.
So maybe we start with that. What is a trauma therapist? And then why is it getting so much play? I don't mean that in a negative sense today.
Yeah. So, okay. So let me start with the trauma therapist thing, because technically, like, that's not a discrete thing. Like, there's not a credential that makes you a trauma therapist. There are credentials that can make you, for example, a certified clinical trauma professional or something like that. Well, the reason I say that I'm a trauma therapist is because when I was in my first semester of grad school, I was like in my bio talking about how I was into resilience because I taught resilience in the Army, my first career. And one of my professors was like, "Oh, you're into resilience," and we started talking a little bit. He got me introduced to a type of therapy, and really it's a field that's kind of emerging, of working with the part of your nervous system that's responsible for like your fight flight responses and things like that.
Yeah.
So I started doing that. It's a 3-year long credential called somatic experiencing. And so because
is it somatic?
Somatic, right?
S-O?
Like having to do with the body.
Yeah, got it. Right.
Somatic experiencing. It's a brand right now. The field of understanding, and I'll get into this in the second part of your question, but the field of how we understand trauma is changing significantly. And so I went through that, and because male therapists are uncommon, male trauma therapists with this background are uncommon, and then male trauma therapists who are veterans that work with a lot of first responders. Like, I have a very, very specific need, and so a lot of what I do is trauma work. So that's kind of how I advertise myself. That said, there are other professionals in the field. There's a guy I like and follow on Twitter. He's a professor at University of San Francisco, I think. Jonathan Shedler, he's a psychodynamic guy, Freud, all that kind of stuff. He would say, you shouldn't ever say that. If you're a therapist, you're a therapist. If you know your craft, you know your craft, and you can work with whatever comes to you or learn how to do so, and would be very critical of that. So not everyone in the field even likes that definition, but I put that in there because that's where a lot of my emphasis in education and training is.
Well, I would imagine also that's helpful. I mean, I don't know what's right in that field, but I do know how people think. And, if I have a friend who is a veteran, I have friends that are veterans who saw crazy stuff. One was a corpsman and saw everything, sewed everybody up, and he would be attracted to see that. He would see you say, "Oh, I'm a trauma therapist," veteran. He'd be like, "That's the guy I want to talk to." So I would make sense, and on a practical level, that you would somehow put that out there for people to find you.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of, and I opened my Christian counseling private practice. I was at a regular practice just doing therapy with kind of permission to do Christian counseling.
Right.
I didn't have a lot of education in it or training, but I knew it was something I wanted to be. But that was something as I started that too. Again, your branding almost becomes a kind of filter. You pull in the people that you're like, this is my ideal client, and you filter out the people who would be like, yep, not ever seeing that dude.
Yeah.
So, but the second part of your question,
Yeah.
though, you were asking, so why are we hearing so much about trauma, right? Why
Let me
is
preface-
everything trauma?
Let me preface it too, because I hear people saying things, and some of them are joking, some of them aren't. But I'm 50, so I grew up, and in my family in particular, if you weren't shot at, or shot, or beat with an inch of your life, you don't have trauma. Stop it, you know.
Right.
Well, now I know that that's not the case now, but that is how a lot of people think, and that's why I'm asking. Like, you know, what is the shift? What's happening, and is it good, and does it come with any bad? So that's kind of where I'm coming
Yeah,
from.
yeah, for sure. So I think probably the most helpful place to start is with a definition, right? So when we talk about trauma, we talk about an event. And there are some really good definitions out there. I really should have had one on hand. I don't. There's one that I like out there that has to do with an adverse event that affects somebody physiologically, psychologically, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually to such an extent that they're not readily able to readapt to their normal level of functioning and kind of internal regulation.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
When you get into how we diagnose things like PTSD, there are certain kind of presentations we're looking for, but we could start with trauma as something in any of those categories that it exceeds our capacity to adapt and recover from naturally, right? And so why did it become a thing? Well, I would start, and I think the other Krista McDunn would probably start here too, at this series of experiments in the 90s that started with a research oops, which every good bit of research out there starts with that didn't go the way it was supposed to.
Yeah, a lot of inventions too. Yeah.
Yeah. So the study, which I'll explain in a second, began with, I think it was like a weight loss program, and they were researching some things. They noticed that all the people who were dropping out had some similar life events early on. All these people who weren't able to achieve physical health or had certain types of struggles with physical or psychological health all seemed to have these negative adverse childhood events. So it spawned a series of, it spawned some research that began at the University of Stanford that was called the Adverse Childhood Event, or ACEs study. And what they found was they tracked people across decades, and they found that the number of adverse childhood experiences a person would have early on, that includes things like abuse, it includes things like divorce, it includes things like the death of a loved one, any other major kind of social change that reorganized the child's sense of safety in their world, was not only correlated with psychological problems, relational problems, and addictions, but physical problems like cancer and heart disease.
Really?
And there was a very strong correlation, mortality rates. And so they started looking more and more, and we started researching, okay, so how is it that these core events in our lives, which really just seem kind of circumstantial, and it seems like the normal person goes through a hard time, and you learn your lessons from it, you take your licks, and you grow up. You just kind of move on, right? You get married, you have family, and how is it that these things are still affecting these people psychologically, relationally, bodily, decades down the road? And over the last couple decades, we found that trauma is actually much more neurological than we previously thought. That part of our nervous system that God designed to A, do all the stuff we don't have time to worry about, like keep your heart beating, and B, take care of your survival responses. Its job is to mobilize huge amounts of energy. It's called your autonomic nervous system, very quickly, and then do stuff with that, like choke out a mountain lion. Or I heard a story about a hiker that did that in the Northwest. I was like, man, I've met some pretty tough dudes in the Army. I've never met anyone that tough, right? Or you hear the story about a mom lifting a car off her baby. You think her muscles aren't physically, she's not that big. That didn't come from her muscles. That's not glycogen. That's how much energy the sympathetic branch of your nervous system can mobilize quickly. So we're learning all these things about trauma across time and its health effects. We're learning all these things about our bodies and trauma. And what I said earlier, when something goes from the research to the practitioner level into a popular magazine and then finds its way into the common vernacular, when I started my training in this somatic therapy, somatic experiencing in early 2017, the people who were teaching me were like, in 5-6 years, everybody's going to be doing this and talking about this. And that has an upside because you're like, great, I'm ahead of the bell curve. Like I got my niche. I can, go in there and be, like, I'm one of 2 Christian practitioners in the triangle that I'm aware of that has this credential.
Wow.
There's 2 of us. And so, hey, that's great. Now, the downside to that is there are a lot of these quote unquote experts suddenly on the internet who you've read some articles, you read a book or 2. That's good. You should read. But there's a lot of information out there along with the good information that can be super confusing. Like, wait a minute. I always thought that I was super organized because, when I was 19, I joined the Army and you just had to be organized. And so I just adapted. But now you're telling me that's a trauma response? So that's where lot of where everything is trauma, and trauma is so in our vernacular now, right? And there's some good stuff there. There's some good reasons. I'll say this too, and I say this in a lot of my trainings I do for pastors and first responders. I work with a group that works with first responders here, and try to do some stuff with churches and ministries. But understand that trauma itself is ubiquitous. All of us at some point in time in our life are going to go through something, a major illness or injury, the death of a loved one.
Yeah.
It could be abuse. It could be the vicarious trauma that you pick up from being someone like a first responder or a pastor, where you sit with everybody else's trauma all day. Like, there are trainings for us as trauma providers to learn how to deal with the impact it has on you. Over the pandemic, I started doing some trainings in 2020 because I was like, oh, wait a minute. There's another group that that happens to all the time, right? All of us will go through something traumatic. Not all of us will be equally traumatized.
Right. Well, that's the question that I had, right? I have a bunch of the questions. And one of them is, because I've experienced this on both ends of the spectrum, right? And actually it was David Murray. I don't know if you know who David Murray is. He wrote Christians Get Depressed Too. Brilliant theologian, reformed, old school, Scottish, blood in his hair. Like, well, he's a gentleman. He doesn't have blood, but he's Scottish. So I imagine him with blood in his hair. Anyway, was a professor at Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary. He helped me through my mental breakdown back in 2011. One of the things that he helped me to begin to address was that there are, he didn't call them trauma, and I don't think that it's trauma, but maybe it is. But what he was showing me was, like, there are things in your life that you are not accounting for as burdens, as hardships, as afflictions, and I'm like, well, no, because he would say, like, this, like, taking care of your mother and your father in their state 24/7, that's a burden. And I was like, it's not a burden, it's just the way it is. Got to take care of family. It's what we do. Boom, boom, boom. And he's like, no, man, fine. All that's fine. But it's a burden that is going to wear you down if you don't recognize it for what it is. And so I'm thinking about this trauma issue. And on one end of the spectrum, there are people that have experienced trauma but aren't recognizing it. And then aren't there people on the other end who are saying that they've been traumatized, but they're just being big babies? And I know that that's super insensitive, but I'm asking the question because that's how I think. Like, some people are being big babies, and some people, is there a spectrum, or am I just completely an insensitive jerk?
So, well, Joe, you are an insensitive jerk.
I figured.
And the year that Joe had his breakdown was the year I got saved. So there was
Look
balance that year, I swear. Right?
That's
I don't know
good.
if we're there, but whatever. No, but okay. So, are there people who? And I'm going to tweak your language a little bit, Joe, because this, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds, because this topic we could do an entire talk episode on. When we talk about people's relationship to their diagnoses.
Okay.
I've had people come in diagnosis in hand
I can imagine.
to me. I want to say, please don't confuse your Google search
Right.
with my 2 college degrees. Like,
Yeah.
don't what? No, I don't obviously, but a person's relationship to the thing that they're using to explain themselves and their experience is very important.
Mm.
Whether that's a personality test, whether that, and I'm not hating on personality tests. If it's a useful tool for you, it's a useful tool,
Right.
right? Whether it's relating styles and understanding things like love languages, whether it's a diagnosis, whether it's a label like trauma or something like codependency, right? That may or may not itself be a diagnosis, but it's a label we can grab onto. It's a handle. And I would say that I think there are people who want an explanation for their experience. And if what we're going to are all the experts that are now out there, and it was not mindfulness for a while. Now it's trauma. It'll be something else in a couple of years, trust me.
Right.
But when we have that label, it can actually keep us from doing deeper work, both therapeutically and theologically. It can keep us from doing deeper work because we got the quick answer and went, okay, that's my thing. That's this. That's what I
Right.
need in order to understand myself and my experience. So there is that.
Yeah.
There are also people who have trauma histories that they haven't been addressing because they view themselves as functional, and then went and saw a therapist who was trauma informed and was like, no, that's not normal. I literally had a client one time who told me he had no trauma history, and a couple sessions in was describing the time he went to go buy beer at age 18 and accidentally got kidnapped because he got in the wrong car and was on a high speed like police chase. And I was like, okay.
But his
So,
relationship to trauma, like you were saying, that's really helpful for me. Like you're the way trauma impacts you is going to be different from person to
yeah.
person, and so it's not just the event, right? I mean, I've talked about this with my wife before, because we're rather stoic. That doesn't mean we're healthy at all, but we tend to be rather stoic and steady, at least externally. But we've described it like if we're riding in a car, I'll make up a friend's name, Billy Bob. And if we're riding in a car with Billy Bob and we hit the same pothole, Jen and I are like, hit a pothole. Billy Bob thought we almost crashed the car. It's the same, it's the same event, but his
Right.
perception of it, and he's not lying. He's not embellishing like some people would, but Billy Bob's not. That's actually how it felt to him. And so I get that people are going to interact with trauma differently based on a whole host of things that I'm sure are way beyond my pay grade. But the trauma talk I think is good because I'm all about health and human flourishing and applying truth to everybody. But I keep seeing trauma discussion come up online, and I see Christians talking about it, and then I see some Christians who. Okay, let me restart. I see some Christians. I'm trying to be like you. I'm trying to be nice.
You're doing great.
Who are big babies. No, I see some of these guys who are saying things along the lines of like, we don't need trauma informed counselors. I think I've literally seen that. We need biblically informed counselors, as if they're mutually exclusive. I mean, it's such overly simplistic, silly thinking. What is the resistance? Why are people resistant? Christians who should know better, in my estimation, who are theologically oriented, at least to some degree, they certainly think
Yeah.
they are. Why are you experiencing pushback? And if so, why?
Oh gosh. All right. So, I'll say this: when it comes to biblical counseling and understanding some of the discussion we have in biblical counseling, biblically informed care, and kind of the clinically informed world, it's really important for us to know that we're having the same conversation. I was once listening to the keynote speaker of a major biblical counseling organization who was opening up his talk, and he said he basically defined counseling as imparting wisdom. And I was like, and my first thought was, that's not what I do at all as a clinical mental health counselor. In fact, my unless I have an informed consent to do Christian counseling or biblical counseling, I'm not allowed to give you guidance. I'm supposed to be avoiding that. And my second thought was I had a light bulb, was I was like, oh, that's why we disagree. We're not talking about the same thing. Um, and I think there's a question, maybe a discussion under that discussion about whether we need biblical counseling, do you need a trauma therapist, do you need clinical, and that is, what help do I need, and what does health look like?
Yeah.
And tweeting in all caps is faster and gets more attention
Sure.
than having that particular conversation.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the masses don't want to have a sustained, thoughtful conversation. They want to giggle, chuckle, or rage, and move on. So I get that. So are you saying that because this is how we function at our church.
Mm-hmm.
In our church, we have biblical counselors, we have licensed professional counselors, and we have the CCEF counselor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which so they're not the same as the biblical counselor, but they're closer to that than they seem to be closer. But then they both disagree with each other. Not these two particular people. I just mean in general. So, anyways,
Right.
I will recommend one person. I might recommend one of those three people to somebody because they're best suited for the particular problem as best as I can understand it. And then there are other times where I'm like, well, I would never recommend this person go to see one of those or two of those. They have to go see Krista, right? And that would be my line of thinking, depending on what the need is.
Right.
Do you see it like that? Like there's a place for all of these people, or is it even more complicated than that?
There's absolutely a place for all these people. So when I was teaching, for a little while, I was teaching all the counseling and psychology classes at this prison ministry near where I am. A seminary that I attended needed to set aside, kind of set up. And my working definition in Intro to Biblical Counseling of what biblical counseling is Scripture and its truths applied to the human experience. In the broadest, most general, inclusive sense, Scripture and its truths apply to the human experience. Does that have a place in discipleship? Duh.
Yeah.
Does it have a place in lay counseling ministries? Does it have a place in mental health care? If you are a Christian who is licensed in the mental health care system, yeah, it does. And full disclosure, right? I'm a level 1 certified biblical counselors through ABC, the Association of Biblical Counselors, and trained at the Gospel Care Collective, and I'm going through level 2. All of these levels and types of care are helpful and necessary within the scope of their own practice, right? But just like I get a little gun shy when people start asking me about medications, because even though I'm somewhat familiar with what most psychiatric medications do, like I am not a psychiatrist.
Right.
I can't, I don't, that's out of my scope of practice. I can refer you to a psychiatrist. Same sort of thing. When we're working with an issue where there are not a ton of clinical or physiological considerations, it doesn't seem like, so there's a lot of trauma responses, flashbacks happening, where it's something maybe relational, emotional, that could be relational in terms of other people, relational in terms of me and God, relational in terms of how I'm relating to myself. Clinical care may or may not be necessary.
Right.
There are seasons when I've gone and what I need is actually somebody to work through how I'm making sense of myself and my situation right now. And that's something we can do with a biblical counselor, probably even a little bit better, because you're going to be on the same page as me theologically and have a sense, or you're not going to have the apprehension that some therapists out there might have of, I don't want to impose my own values, or I feel uncomfortable talking about religion or whatever. So,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. That's helpful. I was just talking with a young person who's going through some stuff, and he's emerging out of a particular situation. And as we were talking, I was just trying to encourage him that, like, you're going to have to learn to be you in this new world now, and that's it. takes time to learn to be you, because you were you in this situation, and you're still you, but I mean, like, but the
Right.
healthiest version of yourself, like that just takes time. And I just started to think about, like, well, what kind of counseling would help this person. And I can think of, like, in this particular case, I could think of, well, he needs some biblical counsel. And he can get that from, I mean, I'm not a biblical counselor, but he could get that from me or from somebody else in the church. He can go to a biblical counselor, but I could also see the value of him seeing, a licensed professional counselor. And this was what actually occurred to me while you were talking. So you're not called licensed professional counselor in your state. It's called something else, but
Yeah, it's the same license,
it's the same license. Okay.
but yeah, it's just called something different.
So you've got that, but you're also ACBC, ABC,
ABC. ACBC, I don't think has clinicians among their numbers. They
Okay.
tend to be a little bit more apprehensive about the mental
Yeah,
health.
that's okay. So yeah, there are definitely like different tribes within each of these fields, right? So, but like, I still don't hear a lot of that, like a biblical counselor who's also, a clinician or whatever.
You might be
is that more?
You might be
there's more-
surprised.
Okay.
Yeah, there are. I actually, so when I was starting my private practice, the guy he's at the Gospel Care Collective, Jason Kovacs, who kind of became like a mentor of mine. He's a friend.
I know him. I mean, I don't know him personally, but like, we've interacted
Yeah.
on, yeah.
Yeah, so Jason was like, there was some interaction we were having online, and he was like, you should check out ABC. They're actually very clinician friendly. And I was like, oh, there are actually a lot of people with licenses like mine who are also getting theological training, because we've got this level of clinical training, which is good. But if you want to do solid Christian counseling, you can't have master's degree level clinical training and like Sunday school level theological training.
Right.
That can't be a thing, So there are actually there's an emerging number of us who are like,
cool.
I need to be strong in both worlds.
I love it. I love it. I think that's really cool. Okay, so one of the things that I did want to talk to you about is the discussion of trauma and the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention. And I don't even know where this is going to go. I just want to know, like, what are you thinking about when you think about the Southern Baptist Convention and trauma in light of the sexual abuse, denials, and the reporting and the non-reporting, and the investigation, everything that's going on in SBC. I mean, even if half of our listeners aren't Southern Baptist, they kind of know what's going on to some degree, because there's so much chatter. What is going on in the Southern Baptist Convention as it relates to trauma? Like, help people make sense of maybe what they're starting to see or hear.
Yeah. So on a broad scale, a couple things are happening. Okay. And one of those, in the backdrop of so many other things as we look at the church in America, is the unhitching of civil religion from kind of our social institutions and Christianity. That relationship is disappearing. If not really, some would say already gone. But the people in the pews have not always caught up to that level, right? Are not always tracking how much, or it feels very abrupt. So this is happening in the background. The SBC itself is really in a season of reckoning with abuse in particular, the way that we've mishandled it, the ways that even for a lot of folks who aren't wolves, because there are wolves, there are absolutely wolves. There are people who need to have their names removed from buildings and from like, nope, you have disqualified yourself, who have abused, who have covered up abuse. There are a lot of people who have been pastoring the best they could, discipling the best they could, doing the best they could, and don't really are now kind of entering this moment where they're realizing they've got some stuff wrong. And more I'm finding myself engaging with those people and trying to make it comfortable for them to explore the possibility that, like, people tend to not make up stories about abuse. They tend to make up stories about their marriages being fine, is honestly what happens. They tend to make up stories about their upbringings being spectacular. And so when we hear these stories emerging, and it feels so dissonant with our Sunday, Wednesday experience of like, well, no, I see you every week. Like,
Yeah.
that was going on behind closed. No, Pastor who? What?
Yeah.
No, right? And so socially, there's a lot of dissonance happening right now. There's a lot of stuff coming out. The fact that we can share information as quickly and broadly as we can is expediting that process. And the fact that there's this snowball effect when people start coming out, and it's just a reality socially. When there's this experience that a large percent of the population is stuffing down or hiding or pretending doesn't exist, as more and more people start to step out and be like, I mean, this was the Me Too movement, right? Was like, actually, the more people feel emboldened to be like, actually, and it can be a lot if you're Joe in the pews to take on all at once.
Yeah, I can see it, and I've even tried to. I was talking to somebody about the whole MacArthur situation and what's going on at their church, and so I was. And anybody who listens to the podcast knows that we don't really defend MacArthur. We don't burn him in effigy either. But the best sense that we can make of the situation is that they really screwed up back in the 80s or whenever that was, when this whole thing went down with the abuse situation and all that.
Yeah.
And, I'm confused as to why it's so hard to say, for them to say, hey, you know what? We got that wrong. And admittedly, not as an excuse, but like, back then, nobody was talking about it. Nobody was training pastors and churches on how to deal with this stuff. And so that doesn't excuse it. That's just what we were coming out of. And we mishandled it. We could have done better. We should have done better. But like, I can see that it's really hard for some churches to just be honest about like what has happened or what's transpired or where they need to grow and learn. But I've seen others actually make that shift. Like, and maybe it has something to do with, I'm not trying to be hateful here, but maybe it has something to do with. Maybe it's harder when the platform is that big. When you are a brand, for all the talk of, Mark Driscoll being a brand, John MacArthur is a brand. That is a brand.
Yep.
He's got his name on a Bible. He's a brand. So I can say like that. I can imagine. And again, that's not me hating on. That's me trying to understand. Like I can see how hard it would be,
right,
to deal with that. How do you help people? Like actually, how do you help people like that? Because like a lot of people just want to go like, oh, they're not going to change, and they just
right.
What do you do to try to move the needle in their hearts on these issues?
So I mean, really, that depends on my relationship with them. Like if it's a pastor I've got a relationship with, if it's someone that like we can sit down and talk at least about semi-hard things, and maybe kind of discuss some of what they feel is the implication of like, hey, if I say I'm wrong here, what'll that mean? Yeah. Right? Is that a snowball of the people who've been following my teaching will begin to question everything I've ever said?
Yeah. And they need a safe place to actually ask that question, right?
Yeah.
Like they actually need. It's funny. We're talking about this guy needing a safe space, but like they would, right? Anybody would need.
You absolutely do.
Just to deal with it, yeah.
And there is a little bit too of when my authority as the person applying the Word of God to the human experience gets so intermixed with the authority of God's inerrant word, right? Then for me to say that I was wrong and misapplied that, right, might be to question whether Scripture itself was sufficient to speak to that situation where really what happened was I misapplied Scripture, or maybe I honestly had some hopes that like if I just apply some biblical principles to this really awful family situation happening, that God will do what we hope, right? If you're in ministry, that God does.
Yeah.
bring dead things to life. Like that's what we want. And so I can understand how somebody gets really gun shy about saying, okay, you know what? We got that wrong. And we
Yeah.
got it really wrong. And you're right. There's a part of it that's the brand too. There's absolutely part of it that's brand.
So when we're talking about the SBC and the SBC Executive Committee, all the stuff that's going on, there's a lot of stories that are painful. And do you have hope? Like when you're looking at what's happening in the SBC, are you more hopeful or are you more doubtful? Are you wait and see?
I'm sad, relieved, overwhelmed, and hopeful. I'm sad because like I sit with people who have those stories.
Yeah.
Thing about being the trauma guy in a Christian counseling practice in your local community is, I mean, I mentioned earlier, right? Like veterans and stuff, but you get a lot of people who, I mean, this is their story, and you know that it's happening and it's currently happening, and it does break your heart, and I can see and have a sense of God's providential work in bringing about justice, in bringing up something that we've needed to address for a long time, and now have the opportunity to bring healing into. And there's a sense there of relief of like, and I know that oftentimes, we talk about things like revival, we talk about things like God stirring a great work in our church. Sometimes God doing a really beautiful thing looks ugly,
Yeah.
especially on the front end.
Yeah. True.
And sometimes it means opening our eyes to stuff that's really, really hard. And I'm overwhelmed. I'm keenly aware of the fact. I had thought when I was active duty that I was going toward pastoral ministry. I was actually, full disclosure, since we're naming it, a full-on Mark Driscoll agent. Like that was my right, what I wanted to be. Ended up providentially in mental health care. Happened to end up having a professor who got me into somatic work about 5-6 years before it started to get popular, and then ended up as a Christian counselor in the Southern Baptist Convention with a trauma background. Like I have to weekly remind myself that it is not my job to heal the triangle.
Yeah.
Because what you look around, I mean, a lot of us in our profession the last couple of years have gotten really burned out.
Yeah.
It is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And at the same time, right? And this is probably the biggest anchor for my soul in God's sovereignty is to know that it's okay for me to panic and to be outraged and have all the big feelings and to be losing my mind because I can hold on to zero emergencies have ever happened in the throne room of heaven. It's never happened.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. I mean, I can imagine, and I've talked to counselors, like, what it's like to counsel someone, clinically and not have the freedom, in that particular, in a particular situation where you would really like to say more in certain situations. But you're still serving them because we're these psychosomatic beings, right? And so we've got all these different levels at which we need health and healing. And so I can imagine that there's a burden that you have, but even when you have the burden and you can't necessarily get to maybe the gospel, for example, your theology still comforts you because like you're doing preparatory work with them to hear the gospel, and that God is sovereign in all of these things. He's orchestrating these events to do something great. So I think I would really have I know that I would struggle a lot more if I was disconnected from theology.
Yeah. So cool story. When I was in graduate school, you have to do like 100 hours in your practicum and 600 hours over a couple of semesters, not all at once, over in your internship. And I was at this small community counseling center. Now, when you're a Christian counselor, you can have this thing called an informed consent where you sign and I sign it, and we can talk about the gospel and theological things and pray and use scripture in session. But I didn't have that. And there was this woman who came in. She was working through some anxiety. And she was telling me over the course of our counseling about how she'd been beginning to attend church, and she was wrestling. She was in a small group. She was wrestling with some of what she heard. They were working through the book of James, and I prayed for this woman weekly. I'm not going to say daily. I probably didn't pray for her daily, but I was praying for this woman weekly. I couldn't share anything about my faith, but I could help her explore how she was seeing her spiritual self, as I might frame that, interacting with her anxiety. Ran into her 2 years ago. Was it last year? It might have. No, it was last year at a birthday party for my son. Who, like, her kid was there too, kind of thing. And she was like, "Oh, hey, it's my old counselor. Oh, hey, it's Dave." And I was like, "Oh, by the way, I'm a believer. I was praying for you the whole time you were over at this counseling." She was like, "What?" I mean, it happens.
Yeah,
right?
That's cool. I like how it's always encouraging to see the way that God orchestrates these events, even our struggles and hardships. Man, I want you to come back on the podcast because I want to talk about more stuff. I want to get into some issues with you. And maybe, I don't know that we'll have time, but I hear you're into like Christian fitness. Is that right? You like Christian fitness? Because like it's like a Christian fitness program.
CrossFit.
Yeah, that sounds like a Christian thing. Is that a Christian thing?
We'll talk about CrossFit, and we covered Deadheads today. So
okay, all right. So it sounds very Christian. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is it like a Christic manhood sort of fitness?
Oh my.
Is it?
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll definitely need to do this again.
I don't want to corrupt you. You're such a kind person, and not like me. So I'll try not to lead you in a bad direction where you're making too much fun of people. I will do it, but I will try to let you stay in your lane. You can be polite and professional, and I will be sarcastic and annoying. Listen, guys, if you enjoy Doctrine and Devotion, we're so glad that you listen, and we hope that you will tell a friend. You can follow us on our socials at Doc and Devo, Instagram and Twitter, and you can follow David Hughes. It's at Dave Evan Hughes. We'll link to that in the show notes, so you can chop it up with him online. He'll engage. Right?
Would love to talk with him.
Yeah, he'll do it. Tell a friend, and listen, if you want to support the podcast, not only can you subscribe on iTunes or whatever you like to listen to us on, but you can actually support the podcast by becoming a member of All Access. All Access gives you theological reflections Monday through Friday and a special podcast called Banter of Truth, normally with me and Jimmy. Sometimes when Jimmy can't make it, somebody else has to step in on that one as well, but it's a good time. That allows us to do more and more of what we're trying to do here for you all. Thanks for listening, guys, and God bless.